You might think of a map as a picture that always has north at the top, but for the people of ancient Egypt, the world was defined not by a compass, but by the flow of a single, massive river. To them, up was south, where the river began, and down was north, where it ended. This is why the southern part of the country is called Upper Egypt, and the northern part, near the sea, is called Lower Egypt, which can be confusing if you're just looking at a modern map. The river flows from the highlands of East Africa all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, a journey of over 4,000 miles, making it the longest river in the world, though some geographers in the Amazon might argue about that. If you're finding the rhythm of these facts helpful for relaxing, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more quiet history. The Egyptians didn't call their country Egypt. That's a Greek word, Egyptos. They called it Kemet, which literally translates to the Black Land. This wasn't about the people's skin, but about the thick, black silt that the river deposited on the banks every single year. This black soil was the only reason anyone could live there at all. Step just a few miles away from the river bank, and the ground turns to scorched sand and rock. They called this the Red Land, or Deshret, which is where we get the word desert. It was a world of chaos and death, separated from the world of life by just a few steps. It's easy to assume that living in a desert means you're always desperate for water, but the Nile was a reliable machine. It didn't just flow, it pulsed. Every year, like clockwork, the river would swell and burst its banks. This wasn't a disaster they feared. It was the most important event in their lives. They called it the inundation. Without it, the Black Land would dry up and everyone would starve. The water came from two main sources far to the south. The White Nile, which starts around Lake Victoria, provided the steady flow, but the Blue Nile, coming from the mountains of Ethiopia, was the wild one. When the monsoon rains hit Ethiopia, the Blue Nile rushed down with tremendous force, pushing all that rich black volcanic soil into the main river and carrying it all the way to Egypt. Because this happened every year, the Egyptians didn't use 4 seasons like we do. They had 3. The first season was Akhet, the season of the inundation. It usually began in June and lasted until September. During this time, the farm fields were completely underwater. You couldn't do any farming. Instead of sitting around, this was often when the farmers were drafted by the government to work on big building projects, like moving stones for temples or pyramids. They weren't slaves. They were paying their labor tax while their fields were soaking. To measure how good the flood would be, they built special structures called nilometers. These were essentially stone staircases descending into the river, or sometimes deep wells with markings on the wall. Priests would check the water level against the markings. If the water rose to a specific height, often around 16 cubits, it was a good Nile. That meant enough water to fill the irrigation canals and deposit silt, but not so much that it would sweep away villages. If it was too low, there would be famine. If it was too high, there would be destruction. Here is the boring part that is actually quite critical. The government used these measurements to decide how much tax you would pay that year. If the nilometer showed a high flood, the scribes assumed you would have a bumper crop, so they raised your taxes before you had even planted a single seed. If the water was low, they might lower the taxes, but you were probably going to be hungry anyway. By October, the waters would start to recede, leaving behind that layer of wet, black mud. This marked the beginning of the second season, Pere, the season of emergence. This was the busiest time of the year. The soil was soft enough that you didn't need heavy machinery. farmers would walk through the mud scattering seeds, and then they would drive animals, pigs, sheep, or cows, over the field to trample the seeds into the earth so birds wouldn't eat them. It was a simple, effective system. The main crops weren't what you might see in a modern vegetable garden. They mostly grew emmer wheat and barley. Emmer wheat is a tricky grain. The chaff sticks to the kernel very tightly, meaning it takes a lot of hard work to pound and grind it into flour. This grit from the grinding stones often ended up in their bread, which is why we find so many ancient mummies with terribly worn-down teeth. The barley was mostly used for beer, which was a thick porridge-like drink that everyone, even children, consumed, because it was safer than drinking standing water and provided a lot of calories. They also grew huge amounts of flax. Flax is a plant with a tough, fibrous stem and a pretty blue flower. They didn't eat it. They beat the stems to separate the fibers and spun them into linen. Almost everyone in ancient Egypt wore linen clothes. It's light, it breathes well in the heat, and it's easy to wash. Wool from sheep was available, but the priests considered it unclean, so you could never wear it into a temple. To move water from the canals to the higher fields, they didn't have pumps. They used a tool called a shaduf. It's a simple lever, a long pole on a pivot. On one end is a bucket, and on the other is a heavy counterweight, usually a big rock or a bag of mud. You pull the bucket down into the water, and the counterweight helps you lift it back up. It's repetitive, back-breaking work, lifting bucket after bucket, hour after hour, under the hot sun. It's a technology that works so well that if you go to rural Egypt today, you can still see farmers using shadufs, exactly like their ancestors did 3,000 years ago. Another tool you would see in every field was the hoe. It wasn't the long-handled garden hoe you might buy at a hardware store. It was short, made of two pieces of wood tied together with rope in an acute angle, looking a bit like the letter A. You had to bend over at the waist to use it, hacking at the earth to break up clods of mud. If you look at ancient paintings, you'll see farmers bent double, working these short hoes. They didn't just grow food, they grew paper. The papyrus plant grew in thick marshes along the riverbanks, especially in the delta region in the north. It's a tall reed with a triangular stem. To make paper, they would cut the stem into strips, lay them side by side, then put another layer of strips on top at a right angle, and pound them together until the sticky sap acted like glue. Fascinating stuff, right? And hey, subscribe if you want to. More boring facts are here whenever you need them. You'll always know where to find Keeper of Sleep when you can't sleep. Now, speaking of the marshes, the river was also a dangerous place. You didn't just jump in for a swim without looking. The Nile crocodile can grow up to 20 feet long and is an ambush predator. They would wait at the water's edge for animals or people. The Egyptians respected them so much, they had a god with a crocodile head, Sobek, whom they prayed to for protection from the very animals he represented. But the crocodile wasn't the most dangerous thing in the water. That title belonged to the hippopotamus. Hippos are aggressively territorial and can easily capsize a small reed boat, and they are surprisingly fast swimmers. A male hippo can weigh 3,000 pounds and snap a human in half. Despite the danger, the river was the main highway. Egypt didn't have many good roads for a long time. If you wanted to go anywhere, you took a boat. The wind in Egypt usually blows from north to south, coming off the Mediterranean Sea. This was incredibly convenient. If you wanted to travel south, upstream, you raised a sail and let the wind push you against the current. If you wanted to go north, downstream, you just took the sail down and let the river current carry you. This is why in hieroglyphs, the symbol for traveling south is a boat with a sail, and the symbol for traveling north is a boat with no sail. The third season was Shemu, the season of harvest. This started around March or April. This was a time of stress and hard labor. The tax collectors would show up with their scribes to measure exactly how much grain you had harvested. The scribes would sit with their legs crossed, a wooden pallet on their knees, recording every basket of wheat. The farmers used sickles to cut the grain. These sickles were made of wood with sharp pieces of flint inserted along the edge. Metal was expensive and reserved for weapons or luxury items, so stone tools were used for farming long after the Bronze Age began. Once the grain was cut, it had to be threshed. They didn't do this by hand if they could help it. They would spread the wheat on a hard floor and drive cattle over it again. The heavy hooves of the cows would break the grain heads apart from the stalks. Then came winnowing. You would use a wooden scoop to throw the grain mixture into the air. The heavy grain would fall straight down, while the lighter chaff and dust would blow away in the breeze. The women usually did the winnowing, and the men did the cutting. The grain was stored in large communal silos or granaries. These were often made of mud brick with a hole in the top to dump the grain in, and a small sliding door at the bottom to take it out. Storing grain was a matter of national security. A good harvest had to last. If the next flood was too low, that stored grain was the only thing keeping the society from collapsing. The cats were actually domesticated largely to protect these granaries. Rats and mice would swarm the food stores, so having a few cats around wasn't just cute, it was pest control that saved lives. The Delta, or Lower Egypt, was different from the narrow valley of the south. Here, the Nile split into 7 main branches. Today, there are only 2, and fanned out into a triangle shape that looks like the Greek letter delta. This area was swampy, filled with birds like the ibis and the heron. It was harder to control than the single stream of the south, and for a long time, the people of the delta and the people of the valley were culturally distinct. The climate was much the same as it is today, hot and dry, but there is evidence it was slightly wetter in the very early periods. However, rain was so rare in Upper Egypt that it was considered a terrifying omen. If it rained, people thought the sky was malfunctioning. They relied entirely on the river water that had traveled thousands of miles from the tropics, not on water falling from the clouds above their heads. The boundaries of the fields had to be redrawn every single year. When the flood came during Akhet, it washed away all the landmarks and boundary stones. So after the water receded in Pere, a special group of officials called rope stretchers would come out. They used knotted ropes to measure geometry and re-establish exactly who owned which square of mud. This practical need to measure land after a flood is actually one of the main reasons the Egyptians became so good at geometry. As the harvest of Shemu ended and the fields dried out, the ground would crack and harden under the summer sun. The heat would build, the river would shrink to its lowest point, and the people would wait, watching the southern horizon, looking for the first signs of the rising water that would signal the return of Akhet, beginning the cycle all over again. The grain was in the silo, the tax collector was paid, and the land slept, waiting for the gift of the river to return. When we think of a king or a queen today, we think of a person with a crown and a lot of political power. But for the people of ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not just a human leader. He was the bridge between the ordinary world of humans and the unseen world of the gods. In fact, the word pharaoh didn't originally refer to the person at all. It meant great house, referring to the palace complex itself. It wasn't until much later in history that they started using it as a title for the ruler, similar to how we might say the White House to talk about the president's decisions. This ruler was the only person in the entire country who was allowed to communicate directly with the gods. Everyone else had to go through him, or through the priests he appointed. This meant that if the river didn't flood, or if a plague struck, it was technically the pharaoh's fault for not doing his job correctly. To show this divine authority, the pharaoh carried two specific items at all times during ceremonies: the crook and the flail. The crook was a shepherd's hook, a long staff with a curve at the top, symbolizing that the king was the shepherd of his people, guiding and protecting them. The flail was a short stick with 3 dangling beaded strands, which was an agricultural tool used to thrash grain. This symbolized his power to provide food, but also his power to punish. Together, they meant, I feed you and I discipline you. On his head, the pharaoh often wore the double crown, known as the shent. This was actually 2 crowns mashed into one. The white crown of Upper Egypt looked like a tall bowling pin, and the red crown of Lower Egypt looked like a flat chair with a curly wire sticking out of it. By wearing both, he showed he was the lord of the 2 lands. But the most dangerous symbol he wore was right on his forehead: the uraeus. This was a golden cobra, reared up and ready to strike. It wasn't just jewelry. The Egyptians believed this cobra could spit fire at the pharaoh's enemies. One of the strangest stories about a pharaoh involves a king named Pepi II. He ruled for a very long time, possibly over 90 years, which would make him the longest reigning monarch in history. Toward the end of his life, he reportedly developed a deep hatred for flies. To deal with this, he came up with a solution that only a god king could get away with. He ordered slaves to be stripped naked, covered entirely in honey, and then made to stand near him. The flies would be attracted to the sweet, sticky slaves and leave the pharaoh alone. It was a human fly trap, and it apparently worked. Another famous legend concerns the very first pharaoh, Menes, who united the country. After a long and successful reign of over 60 years, the story goes that he was killed by a hippopotamus. It's a rather undignified end for a god, but given how dangerous hippos are, it's historically plausible. Menes is also credited with founding the city of Memphis, which served as the capital for centuries. He built it on a massive dam he constructed to divert the Nile, claiming the land from the water itself. Being a pharaoh wasn't just about sitting on a throne. After you had ruled for 30 years, you had to prove you were still fit to lead. This was done through the Sed Festival, or the Jubilee. It was a massive party for the whole country, but for the pharaoh, it was a physical test. He had to run a race around a marked course, dressed in a special short kilt with a bull's tail attached to the back to symbolize his strength. If he couldn't finish the run, it was seen as a sign that his power was failing. In the very early days of history, some historians believe a king who failed might have been ritually killed, but by the time of the pyramids, they just let him run a shorter course, or did the running symbolically. We often see statues of pharaohs looking young, muscular, and perfect. But the reality was often quite different. Because the royal family wanted to keep the bloodline pure, they often married their siblings or cousins. This incest led to significant genetic problems. Tutankhamun, for example, had a clubfoot, a cleft palate, and severe scoliosis. He couldn't walk without a cane. We know this because over 100 walking sticks were found in his tomb, some of which showed signs of heavy use. Another pharaoh who broke the mold was Akhenaten. He decided that the thousands of gods Egypt worshipped were unnecessary, and that there was only one true God, the sun disk, Aten. He closed the old temples, fired the priests, and built a new capital city in the middle of nowhere. He also changed the way art was made. Instead of the stiff, perfect figures of the past, he ordered artists to show him as he really was, or perhaps as a stylized, almost alien figure, with a potbelly, wide hips, and a long, elongated skull. His revolution didn't last. After he died, his son Tutankhamun restored the old gods, and the people smashed Akhenaten's city to pieces, trying to erase his name from history. The pharaohs also had a massive entourage. One of the most important officials was the fan-bearer on the right of the king. This sounds like a servant's job, but it was actually a high-ranking noble title. It meant you were close enough to the king to hear his whispers. There was also a keeper of the royal sandals, because the king couldn't just leave his shoes lying around where someone might steal them and use them for magic against him. Not all pharaohs were men. Hatshepsut was a woman who ruled as a king. She didn't call herself queen. She used the male titles and even wore the false beard that was part of the royal uniform. She ruled for over 20 years and was one of the most successful builders in Egyptian history. But after she died, her stepson tried to erase her memory, chiseling her name off obelisks and walls. He didn't quite succeed, which is why we know about her today. The pharaoh's life was governed by Ma'at, the concept of cosmic balance. He had to wake up before dawn to perform rituals to help the sun rise. If he slept in, the sun might not come up. It was a heavy burden. Every military victory was his, but every failure was also his. When Ramses II, known as Ramses the Great, fought the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh, he claimed a massive victory. He covered the walls of his temples with scenes of him smashing his enemies. But we now have the Hittite version of the same battle, and it looks more like a draw. Ramses was just a master of propaganda. When a pharaoh died, the panic was real. The horizon had fallen, as they put it. The death of a god-king tore a hole in the fabric of the universe. The transition of power had to be immediate to seal that hole. The crown prince would often take charge of the burial rituals, because the act of burying your father was what legally made you the next king. This is why I, an old advisor, performed the burial for Tutankhamun. It was his way of claiming the throne for himself. Fascinating stuff, right? And hey, subscribe if you want to. More boring facts are here whenever you need them. You'll always know where to find Keeper of Sleep when you can't sleep. Now, speaking of burial rituals, one of the more intimate facts about royal life involves their diet. Despite having the best food in the land, many mummies of pharaohs show signs of obesity and clogged arteries. They ate a lot of honey, bread, beer, and fatty meat from temple sacrifices. It seems the living god suffered from heart disease just like modern humans. The great royal wife was the pharaoh's chief queen, but he had many other wives and concubines. Ramses II is said to have fathered over 100 children. He lived so long, into his 90s, that he outlived 12 of his own heirs. By the time he finally died, his 13th son, Merneptah, was already an old man himself. The end of a pharaoh's life was the beginning of his most important journey. As the palace went into mourning, the body was taken to the place of purification to be washed. The throne was empty. The palace was silent, and the scribes stopped dating documents by the old king's years and started a new count for the new king. The living god was dead. Long live the living god. The cycle of dynasties continued, unbroken, for 3,000 years, a stability that no other civilization has ever matched. The pharaohs we just discussed didn't just want to rule. They wanted to last forever. This brings us to the most iconic structures on Earth, the pyramids. But before the pyramids, there were mastabas. The word mastaba is Arabic for bench, because that's exactly what they look like from a distance. Massive, rectangular benches made of mud brick. The earliest kings were buried in these flat-topped tombs. They were simple, effective, and frankly, not very impressive compared to what came later. The evolution began with a man named Imhotep. He was the vizier to King Djoser, and he had a radical idea. Instead of one mastaba, he stacked 6 of them on top of each other, each one smaller than the one below it. The result was the step pyramid of Saqqara. It wasn't smooth. It looked like a giant staircase climbing into the sky. This was the first time in history that anyone had built a monument of this size entirely out of stone instead of mud brick. It was a technological leap as significant as the invention of the airplane. From there, the architects kept experimenting. They didn't always get it right. The bent pyramid of Snefru is a perfect example of a construction error frozen in time. They started building it at a steep 54-degree angle, but halfway up, the structure began to crack under its own weight. Panic ensued. They had to quickly change the angle to a shallower 43 degrees to stop it from collapsing. That's why it looks bent today. It's not a style choice. It's a desperate fix. Finally, they got it right with the Red Pyramid, the first true smooth-sided pyramid. But the peak of this era was, of course, the Great Pyramid of Giza, built for Khufu. Let's address the elephant, or the alien, in the room. We know exactly who built the pyramids, and it wasn't little green men. We have found the workers' villages. We have found their bakeries. We have found the bones of the workers themselves. These bones tell a story of hard labor, yes, but also of care. Many skeletons show signs of healed fractures, meaning that if a worker broke his arm on the job, he wasn't discarded. He was given medical treatment, his arm was set, and he was fed while he healed. These workers were not slaves. They were paid laborers, likely drafted during the flood season when farming was impossible. We have records of their rations. They ate meat, beef, sheep, and goat every single day. That's a diet better than most modern Egyptians had until recently. They drank beer and ate bread, and they worked in gangs with names like the Drunkards of Menkaure or the Friends of Khufu. They had pride in their work, leaving graffiti on the stones deep inside the pyramid, where no one would ever see it but the gods. The stones themselves are a marvel of logistics, not magic. The core of the pyramid is made of local limestone, quarried right there on the Giza plateau. These blocks are rough and vary in size, but the outside was originally covered in casing stones made of Tura limestone. This is a high-quality, brilliant white stone that was quarried miles away on the other side of the river. When the pyramid was new, these casing stones were polished to a mirror finish. Under the Egyptian sun, the pyramid wouldn't have looked like steps. It would have shone like a star on earth, visible for miles. Sadly, almost all of this white casing was stripped away in the Middle Ages to build the mosques and palaces of Cairo. Moving these stones required physics, not levitation. The average block weighs about 2.5 tons, roughly the same as a large SUV. But some of the granite beams in the king's chamber weigh up to 80 tons. That's more than 10 elephants. They moved them on sledges, wooden platforms with runners. To reduce friction, they poured water on the sand in front of the sledge. A wall painting in the tomb of Jehotiotep actually shows a colossal statue being pulled by men, with one guy standing on the front pouring water. Experiments have shown that the right amount of water stiffens the sand, and cuts the pulling force required by half. Inside the Great Pyramid, there are mysterious shafts that run from the king's and queen's chambers toward the outside. For a long time, people called them air shafts, thinking they were for ventilation. But the shafts in the queen's chamber don't actually reach the outside of the pyramid. They stop about 5 inches short. That's terrible ventilation design. Modern robot explorations have revealed small limestone doors with copper handles blocking these shafts. It's far more likely these were soul shafts, designed to allow the spirit of the king to travel to the imperishable stars in the northern sky. Standing guard in front of these mountains of stone is the Sphinx. It is the oldest known monumental sculpture in Egypt. It was carved directly out of the bedrock of the plateau. It wasn't built. It was subtracted from the earth. The head is generally believed to be that of Khafra, the son of Khufu, though some argue it might be Khufu himself. The Sphinx has suffered a lot over the years. The most famous injury is the missing nose. A popular myth says Napoleon's soldiers shot it off with a cannon for target practice. This is historically impossible. Sketches of the Sphinx, drawn by Frederick Louis Norden in 1737, decades before Napoleon was even born, show the nose already missing. The real culprit was likely a Sufi Muslim fanatic named Muhammad Sa'im al-Dar in the 14th century, who damaged the face to protest idolatry. Originally, the Sphinx wasn't just beige stone. It was painted. We have found traces of red pigment on the face, yellow on the body, and traces of blue on the headdress. Imagine that. A bright red face staring across the desert. It would have looked garish to modern eyes, almost like a comic book character. Between its paws, there is a granite slab called the Dream Stele. It tells the story of a prince named Thutmose IV, who fell asleep in the shadow of the Sphinx when he was just a prince. The Sphinx spoke to him in a dream, complaining that it was buried in sand and suffocating. It promised that if Thutmose cleared the sand, he would become pharaoh. He did, and he did. It's a great piece of propaganda to justify why a younger son jumped the line of succession. The precision of the Great Pyramid is staggering. The 4 sides are aligned to true north, south, east, and west, with an accuracy of 3/66 of a degree. That's more accurate than the Prime Meridian Observatory in Greenwich, London. The base is level to within less than an inch. All of this was achieved with simple tools: copper chisels, stone pounders, wooden levels, and water. They didn't have iron. They didn't have wheels for lifting. They just had time, organizational genius, and a lot of manpower. Fascinating stuff, right? And hey, subscribe if you want to. More boring facts are here whenever you need them. You'll always know where to find Keeper of Sleep when you can't sleep. Now, speaking of organizational genius, the era of the giant pyramids didn't last forever. Eventually, the pharaohs realized that a 480-foot tall stone mountain is basically a giant neon sign saying, "There is gold in here." Robbers looted almost every pyramid in antiquity. The architects tried to outsmart them with decoy chambers, sliding portcullis blocks of granite, and dead ends. But the robbers, who were often the very workers who built the tombs, knew the secrets. By the time of the New Kingdom, the strategy changed completely. Instead of building mountains, they decided to hide. They chose a remote dry canyon in the south, now known as the Valley of the Kings. Here, they dug their tombs deep into the rock faces, hidden from view. They posted guards on the cliffs above. They kept the location of the tombs a state secret. It was an admission of defeat. The Great Pyramid was a statement of absolute confidence. The Valley of the Kings was a statement of paranoia. Yet even in their ruin, the pyramids did exactly what they were intended to do. The names of Khufu, Khafra, and Menkora are still spoken 4,500 years later. They achieved the closest thing to immortality that any human can hope for: to be remembered. The casing stones are gone, the gold is gone, and the mummies are in museums, but the mountains of stone remain, the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world that is still standing. To understand how the Egyptians saw the world, you have to understand their family tree of gods, which they called the Ennead. It started with Atum, the creator god, who emerged from the chaotic waters of Nun on the first mound of earth. He was lonely, so he created 2 children, Shu, air, and Tefnut, moisture, by spitting them out. These 2 had children of their own, Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. This is where things get visually interesting. If you look at temple ceilings, you'll often see Nut depicted as a giant woman arched over the earth, her hands and feet touching the horizons. Her body is covered in stars. Sometimes she is shown as a giant cow with the stars on her belly. The Egyptians believed that every evening Nut swallowed the sun god Ra, and he traveled through her body during the night, which was the underworld, to be reborn from her womb at dawn. This cycle of swallowing and rebirthing happened every single day for eternity. Geb and Nut had 4 children who became the most famous players in Egyptian mythology: Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. Osiris was the first king of Egypt, a benevolent ruler who taught humans how to farm. But his brother Set was jealous. In a story that feels like a Shakespearean tragedy, Set murdered Osiris. The details vary, but the most famous version says Set tricked Osiris into lying down in a beautiful chest, then nailed it shut and threw it into the Nile. Later, Set chopped his brother's body into 14 pieces and scattered them across Egypt. Isis, Osiris's wife and sister, spent years wandering the land to find these pieces. She found all of them except one, the phallus, which had been eaten by a fish in the Nile. She reassembled her husband and used her magic to revive him just long enough to conceive a son, Horus. Osiris then descended to the underworld to become the king of the dead, while Horus stayed on Earth to fight his uncle Set for the throne. This battle between Horus, order, and Set, chaos, is the central conflict of Egyptian myth. Every pharaoh considered himself the living Horus while he was alive, and became Osiris when he died. These weren't just stories they told around a campfire. They were the operating system of the universe. To keep this system running, they built massive temples. But an Egyptian temple wasn't like a modern church or mosque where people gather to pray. It was a machine for maintaining the cosmos. The public was rarely allowed inside the deep sanctuaries. The temple was the house of the god, and the priests were the servants. Every morning, before the sun rose, the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies, the deepest, darkest room in the temple. He would break the clay seal on the doors of the shrine and wake up the god. Inside was a statue, usually made of gold or gilded wood. The priest believed this statue was literally inhabited by the spirit of the deity. He would wash the statue, dress it in fresh linen clothes, and apply makeup, specifically kohl, to its eyes. He would offer it food and wine, which were later removed and eaten by the priests, since the god only consumed the spiritual essence of the meal. One of the most ubiquitous symbols you'll see is the scarab beetle. To us, it's a dung beetle. It spends its day rolling a ball of manure across the ground to lay its eggs in. To the Egyptians, this was a perfect metaphor for the sun god, Khepri. They believed Khepri rolled the sun across the sky just like a beetle rolls a dung ball, and since baby beetles emerge fully formed from the dung, they thought beetles were self-created, just like the creator God. So this humble insect became the symbol of rebirth and existence itself. Then there is Ma'at. She is often depicted as a goddess with a single ostrich feather on her head, but she is more than a person. Ma'at is the concept of truth, balance, order, and justice. The universe is a constant battle between Ma'at and Isfet, chaos. The pharaoh's main job description wasn't ruler, it was maintainer of Ma'at. If he didn't rule justly, Ma'at would be lost, and the world would dissolve back into the primordial waters of Nun. The Egyptians were also very practical about their theology. They practiced something called syncretism, which is a fancy way of saying they mashed gods together. If you had a powerful local god like Amun in Thebes, and the sun god Ra was powerful in Heliopolis, you didn't fight about which one was better. You just combined them into Amun-Ra. This created a super god that had the hidden power of Amun and the visible power of Ra. They did this constantly. Ptah-Sokar-Osiris is a three-way combination connected to death and creation. It wasn't confusing to them, it was just efficient. The gods were not immortal in the way we think. They could age. In one myth, Ra gets so old that he drools and his bones turn to silver and his flesh to gold. They could also die and be reborn, like Osiris. But they could also be killed permanently if they were forgotten. This is why erasing a name was such a terrible punishment. If you chiseled a god's name off a wall, you were cutting off their food supply of prayers and memory. Not all gods were human-shaped. Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, had the head of an ibis bird, or sometimes a baboon. Anubis, the god of embalming, had the head of a jackal. This wasn't random. Jackals were often seen prowling around graveyards, digging up shallow graves. By making the god of the dead a jackal, they were trying to appease the very creature that threatened their bodies, turning a scavenger into a protector. One specific ritual that happened daily was the offering of the eye of Horus. This refers to the myth where Set gouged out Horus's eye during their battles. Thoth healed the eye, and Horus gave it to his father Osiris to help him in the afterlife. In the temple, offering wine or bread was symbolically offering the eye, restoring what was broken and making the god whole again. Fascinating stuff, right? And hey, subscribe if you want to. More boring facts are here whenever you need them. You'll always know where to find Keeper of Sleep when you can't sleep. Now, speaking of broken things, there was even a god of silence, Meretseger. She was a cobra goddess who lived in the mountain peak shaped like a pyramid, overlooking the Valley of the Kings. Her name means she who loves silence. She watched over the workers in the village. If they swore falsely or committed a crime, she would strike them with blindness or snake bites. But if they apologized and were humble, she would heal them. It was a very personal relationship between the common worker and the divine. The temples themselves were designed to mimic the moment of creation. The floor rose slightly as you went deeper in, representing the primeval mound rising from the water. The columns were carved to look like papyrus and lotus plants, turning the hall into a stone marsh. The ceiling was painted blue with gold stars. Walking into a temple was walking back to the beginning of time, before all the mistakes of humanity happened. Eventually, this divine family became so complex that the priests held immense power, sometimes even more than the pharaoh. The temple of Amun at Karnak controlled vast tracts of land, thousands of people, and hundreds of ships. It was a state within a state. But no matter how powerful the priest got, The system relied on one core belief, that death was not the end, but merely a transition to another state of being, a state that required a lot of preparation. When an Egyptian died, they didn't just disappear, they went west. This was a euphemism for death, because the sun set in the west, disappearing into the underworld every night. But to ensure they could wake up again like the sun, their body had to be preserved. If the physical body decayed, the Ka, spirit double, and Ba, personality, would have nowhere to live, and the soul would perish. This necessity birthed the science of mummification. The process was long, taking exactly 70 days. It began in the Ibu, or place of purification. The embalmers were priests who wore jackal masks to impersonate Anubis. Their first major task was removing the brain. They didn't think the brain was important. They thought it was just stuffing for the skull. So they took a long metal hook, inserted it through the left nostril, broke the thin bone at the top of the nose, and whisked the brain until it liquefied and drained out. Anything left over was dissolved with drugs. They threw the brain away. The heart, however, was left inside the chest. The Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of intelligence and emotion. You would need it for the final judgment. The other internal organs, the lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines, were removed through a slit in the left side of the abdomen. These were not thrown away. They were washed in palm wine and spices, then packed into 4 special containers called canopic jars. Each jar had a specific head representing one of the 4 sons of Horus. The human-headed jar, Imseti, held the liver. The baboon-headed jar, Hapi, held the lungs. The jackal-headed jar, Duamutef, held the stomach. And the falcon-headed jar, Kebesenuef, held the intestines. These jars were placed in a special chest near the mummy. Once the body was empty, it was washed and then buried in natron. Natron is a naturally occurring salt found in dry lake beds. It's incredibly effective at drying things out. They didn't just sprinkle it. They piled it on until the body was completely covered. It stayed there for 40 days. This process removed all the moisture, leaving the skin tough and leathery, like jerky. A dried body won't rot. After the salt bath, the body was washed again and rubbed with sweet-smelling oils and resins to make the skin supple again. Then came the wrapping. This could take weeks. They used hundreds of yards of linen. They didn't just wrap the whole body at once. They wrapped each finger and toe individually first. As they wrapped, priests recited spells and tucked protective amulets into the bandages. A heart scarab was placed over the heart to stop it from betraying the owner during judgment. Finally, the mummy was placed in its coffin, often a series of nested coffins like Russian dolls. But before the tomb was sealed, one final ritual had to happen: the opening of the mouth. A priest touched the face of the mummy case with a special adze, a woodworking tool. This wasn't symbolic. They believed this magic literally restored the mummy's ability to breathe, speak, eat, and drink in the afterlife. Without this, you would be a statue for eternity, unable to enjoy the offerings left for you. Once the tomb was sealed, the soul began its terrified journey through the Duat, or the underworld. This wasn't a peaceful place. It was a landscape of fire, darkness, and monsters. There were lakes of flames and gates guarded by demons with names like He Who Dances in Blood. To get past them, you needed passwords. This is what the Book of the Dead was for. It wasn't a Bible. It was a cheat sheet. It contained the maps, spells, and passwords you needed to survive the journey. The climax of this journey was the Hall of Two Truths. Here, the deceased stood before Osiris and 42 judges. This is where the weighing of the heart took place. Anubis would lead you to a giant scale. On one side he placed your heart. On the other side he placed the feather of Ma'at, the symbol of truth. If you had lived a good life, if you hadn't stolen, killed, or lied, your heart would be light, balancing perfectly with the feather. But if your heart was heavy with sin, the scales would tip. Waiting beside the scale was Amit, the devourer. She was a nightmare hybrid, part crocodile, part lion, and part hippopotamus. If your heart was heavy, Amit would eat it instantly. This was the second death. You ceased to exist. No hell, just total oblivion. But if you passed, you were declared true of voice. Osiris welcomed you into his kingdom. This wasn't a spiritual cloud world. It was the field of reeds, Aru, and it looked exactly like Egypt, but perfect. The crops grew taller, the Nile never dried up, and there were no mosquitoes. You got your house back, your dog back, and your family back. Fascinating stuff, right? And hey, subscribe if you want to. More boring facts are here whenever you need them. You'll always know where to find Keeper of Sleep when you can't sleep. Now, speaking of getting your house back. But here is the catch. Even in paradise, you had to work. The gods still needed farming done. The Egyptians, who worked hard all their lives, didn't really want to farm for eternity. So they came up with a solution. Shapti dolls. These were small blue figurines, often holding tiny hoes and baskets. They were inscribed with a spell that said essentially, if I am called to work, you say, here I am. They were magical substitute workers. Wealthy people were buried with 365 of them, one for every day of the year, plus overseer dolls to manage the crew. The rich could afford elaborate mummification, but the poor often had to settle for the economy package. This involved injecting oil of cedar into the body to liquefy the organs without cutting the body open, then draining it out. The very poorest were just wrapped in mats and buried in the dry sand. Ironically, the hot, sterile sand often preserved their bodies better than the expensive resins of the pharaohs. We have found sand mummies from before the pyramids that still have hair and skin intact, purely by accident of nature. The afterlife was a place of reunion. Tombs were often called houses of eternity. Families would visit the tombs of their ancestors on feast days, having picnics right outside the chapel door. They would leave food for the car and maybe drink a little beer themselves, sharing a meal with the dead. It wasn't spooky, it was social. The dead were still part of the family, just living in a different room. Finally, successfully entering the field of reeds meant you had become an Ark, a transfigured spirit. You could now travel back and forth between the underworld and the living world. You could watch over your grandchildren. You were effectively a minor god in your own right. The journey west was dangerous and expensive, but the destination was worth it. An eternity of stability in a land that looked just like home, only better. While the pharaohs were worrying about their journey to the stars, the average Egyptian was worrying about something much more grounded. The roof over their head. If you walked into a typical village, you wouldn't see the limestone of the pyramids. You would see mud. Everything was mud. The houses were built from mud bricks mixed with straw and dried in the sun, a material called adobe. It wasn't just because they were poor, it was smart engineering. Mud brick is an incredible insulator. During the scorching day, the thick walls absorbed the heat, keeping the inside cool. At night, as the desert temperature plummeted, the walls released that stored heat, keeping the house warm. Inside these houses, the furniture was sparse. They didn't sleep on soft, fluffy pillows. Instead, they used headrests made of wood or stone. These looked like small stools with a curved top piece to cradle the neck. It looks incredibly uncomfortable to us, but it had a practical purpose. In a hot climate with no air conditioning, sinking your head into a down pillow is a recipe for sweating. The wooden headrest allowed air to circulate around your head, keeping you cool. It also had the added benefit of protecting elaborate hairstyles or wigs from getting messed up while you slept. The kitchen was the heart of the home, but it was also a source of dental destruction. The staple diet was bread and beer, but this wasn't soft white sandwich bread. The grain was ground on stone slabs called saddle querns. As the grinder worked, tiny pieces of the stone would chip off and mix into the flour. Wind-blown desert sand also got into everything. The result was bread that was essentially sandpaper. We know from examining mummies that even young people had teeth worn down to the nerves. Toothaches were a constant, agonizing companion for almost everyone in ancient Egypt. To wash down this gritty bread, they drank beer. But again, this wasn't like a modern lager. Egyptian beer was thick, cloudy, and almost like a soup or porridge. It was made from half-baked barley bread that was crumbled into water and fermented. It was so nutritious that it was considered a food source, not just a beverage. It was often sweet, flavored with dates or honey, and had a relatively low alcohol content, so you could drink it all day without falling over. Workers were often paid in jugs of beer. Speaking of payment, there was no money in ancient Egypt. No coins, no paper bills. The economy worked on a barter system, but it was standardized. They used a unit of account called a deben. A deben was a standard weight of copper, about 90 grams. You didn't actually trade the copper pieces back and forth. You just used them to value things. A sack of grain might be worth 1 deben. A shirt might be worth 5 debens. So if you wanted the shirt, you could give the tailor 5 sacks of grain, or maybe 3 sacks of grain, and a pair of sandals, as long as the value added up to 5 debens. It was a complex mental math that everyone did instinctively. When the work was done, they liked to play games. The most popular board game was called Senet. It had 30 squares arranged in 3 rows of 10. We don't know the exact rules because they never wrote them down. Everyone just knew them. But it seems to have been a race game, similar to backgammon or parcheesi. You threw casting sticks, like dice, to move your pieces. Over time, the game took on a religious significance. Winning at Senet was seen as a sign that you were lucky and would successfully navigate the underworld. Wealthy people were buried with beautiful Senet sets made of ivory and ebony, so they could play in the afterlife. But life wasn't all games. Taxes were brutal. The government took a huge portion of everything you grew, and if you didn't have enough grain, you paid in labor. This was the corvée system. Every able-bodied man owed the pharaoh a certain number of weeks of labor every year. This is how the canals were dug, the temples were built, and the copper was mined. You could be dragged away from your family for months to work in a quarry hundreds of miles away. If you tried to run away, your family could be imprisoned until you returned. The concept of privacy was different too. Most houses had a flat roof, which was used as an extra living room. In the summer, it was too hot to sleep inside, even with the mud bricks, so the whole family would sleep on the roof under the stars. It was a community where everyone knew everyone's business. The villages were tight-knit. If you had a dispute with your neighbor, say, his goat ate your vegetables, you didn't go to a judge immediately. You went to the village elders, who would hold a court at the gate of the town to settle things locally. They also loved their pets. We talked about cats, but they also kept dogs, monkeys, and even geese as pets. Dogs were used for hunting and guarding, but they were also beloved companions. We have found dog collars made of leather with names inscribed on them, like Brave One or North Wind. One dog was even named Useless. It seems the human relationship with dogs hasn't changed much in 4,000 years. Cleanliness was next to godliness, even for the poor. They washed daily in the river or with basins of water. They used natron, the same salt used for mummies, as soap and mouthwash. They rubbed oil on their skin to protect it from the cracking dry heat. To smell good, they used cones of scented fat. Fascinating stuff, right? And hey, subscribe if you want to. More boring facts are here whenever you need them. You'll always know where to find Keeper of Sleep when you can't sleep. Now, speaking of smelling good. At parties, guests would wear a cone made of ox tallow mixed with myrrh or cinnamon on top of their wigs. As the party went on and the room got hot, the fat would slowly melt, dripping perfumed oil down over their hair and shoulders. It sounds messy to us, but to them, it was the height of luxury and kept them smelling fresh in a crowded room. Light was precious. Once the sun went down, the world was pitch black. They used simple oil lamps, essentially a small bowl with a floating wick. The oil was usually castor oil or sesame oil, which burned with a fair amount of smoke. This meant that when the sun set, the day was effectively over. People went to bed early and rose with the dawn. The rhythm of life was dictated entirely by the light. As the sun dipped below the western horizon, the village would grow quiet. The men would return from the fields or the construction sites, their feet dusted with the eternal sand. The women would finish grinding the last of the grain. Families would gather on their rooftops, sharing a jar of thick beer and watching the stars emerge, knowing that somewhere in the distance, the pharaoh was performing the rituals to ensure the sun would rise again tomorrow. The darkness of the desert would close in, leaving only the flickering light of a few oil lamps to hold back the night. We know so much about the Egyptians because they were obsessed with writing things down. But the famous symbols we see on temple walls, the birds, eyes, and snakes, weren't what people used for a grocery list. Those are hieroglyphs, a word that comes from Greek meaning sacred carvings. The Egyptians called them Medu Neter, meaning the words of God. They were beautiful, but incredibly slow to write. Imagine trying to draw a perfect owl every time you wanted to write the letter M. For everyday business, they used a script called hieratic. This was a cursive version of hieroglyphs, like a shorthand. It flowed quickly and could be written rapidly with a brush. Later, an even faster, more abbreviated script developed called Demotic, or the People's Script. It looked almost like scribbles to the untrained eye, but it was the standard for legal contracts and letters for centuries. The material they wrote on was papyrus, the world's first paper. We already talked about how it grows, but the manufacturing process was an industrial secret for a long time. They would peel the green skin off the stalk and slice the white inner pith into long, thin strips. These strips were soaked in water to remove the sugar, which made them flexible. Then, they laid the strips side by side, slightly overlapping, and put a second layer on top at a right angle. They didn't use glue. The natural sap of the plant acted as a bonding agent when they hammered the two layers together. After drying under a heavy stone press, the result was a durable, flexible sheet that could be rolled up into a scroll. Some of these scrolls have survived for 4,000 years, which is better than most hard drives. Becoming a scribe was the golden ticket in Egyptian society. It was one of the few ways a poor boy could rise to power. But the training was brutal. Schools were often attached to temples. Students would start as young as 5 or 6 years old. The discipline was strict. There was a famous Egyptian saying, "The ear of a boy is on his back. He listens when he's beaten." Teachers would use corporal punishment for sloppy handwriting or laziness. To encourage students to stick with it, teachers would have them copy a text called the Satyr of the Trades. It's a poem where a father tells his son how terrible every other job is compared to being a scribe. He says the metal worker stinks like fish eggs, the mason is always exhausted, and the washerman spends his day with the crocodiles. But the scribe is the boss. He doesn't lift heavy things. He just lifts a pen. He directs the work of others. It was pure propaganda, but it worked. The scribe's kit was simple. He carried a wooden pallet with 2 circular depressions for ink, one black, one red. The black ink was made from soot mixed with gum arabic, and the red ink was made from ochre, a type of rusty earth. He used the black for the main text, and the red for headings, important dates, or the names of dangerous spirits, a practice we still use today when we talk about red letter days. His pens were thin reed brushes that he would chew on the end to soften into a tip. The god of writing was Thoth. He is usually depicted as a man with the head of an ibis bird. The ibis has a long, curved beak that looks a bit like a scribe's reed pen. Thoth was the ultimate bureaucrat of the universe. He recorded the result of the weighing of the heart. He also had another animal form, the baboon. This seems odd until you realize that baboons chatter at the sunrise, which the Egyptians interpreted as them praying to Ra. Thoth was the inventor of writing, language, and magic. For over 1,000 years, the ability to read hieroglyphs was lost. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 AD at the Temple of Philae. After that, the language went silent. Scholars in the Middle Ages and Renaissance tried to guess what the symbols meant, but they usually got it wrong, thinking they were purely mystical symbols rather than a phonetic alphabet. They thought a picture of a rabbit meant swiftness, when it actually just made the sound un. The code was finally broken, thanks to a soldier finding a broken rock in 1799. The Rosetta Stone contains the same decree, written in 3 scripts: hieroglyphs at the top, Demotic in the middle, and ancient Greek at the bottom. Since scholars could still read Greek, they had the key. A Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion spent years studying it. He finally realized that hieroglyphs were a mix of sounds, phonograms, and ideas, ideograms. When he cracked the code in 1822, legend says he ran into his brother's office, shouted, "I've got it," and then fainted from exhaustion. Because of Champollion, we can read the personal letters of ancient Egyptians. We know about their lawsuits, their love poems, and their grocery bills. We have a letter from a man complaining that his father is spending too much money on new furniture. We have a will where a woman disinherits her children for not taking care of her. We have the tale of the shipwrecked sailor, an adventure story about a man stranded on an island with a giant serpent who has a beard. Fascinating stuff, right? And hey, subscribe if you want to. More boring facts are here whenever you need them. You'll always know where to find Keeper of Sleep when you can't sleep. Now, speaking of giant serpents, there were also execration texts. These were cursing spells. A scribe would write the name of an enemy, a foreign king, or a rebellious local, on a clay pot or a figurine. Then, they would smash the pot, stab it, and bury the pieces. The idea was that by destroying the name, you were destroying the person's power. It was voodoo before voodoo existed. The scribes were also the keepers of history, but they were selectively honest. They didn't record defeats. If a pharaoh lost a battle, the scribes would just not write about it, or they would spin it into a victory. History was not about what actually happened. It was about what should have happened to maintain Ma'at. One of the most famous scribes was a man named Amenhotep, son of Hapu. He was an architect and official who lived during the New Kingdom. He was so wise and so respected that centuries after he died, he was deified. He became a god of healing and wisdom, one of the few ordinary humans to ever achieve that status, alongside the great cosmic deities. In the scribal schools, they didn't just learn writing. They learned geography, mathematics, and etiquette. A scribe had to know how to address a general, a priest, and a king. They were the glue that held the entire state together. Without them, the taxes wouldn't be collected, the army wouldn't be fed, and the pyramid blocks wouldn't be counted. As the sun sets on the scribe's day, he washes his brushes in his water pot. He rolls up the scroll he has been working on, tying it with a piece of linen string. He places his palette in its wooden case. The ink on his fingers is a badge of honor, a sign that he is one of the silent ones who run the country. He blows out his oil lamp, leaving the room in darkness, knowing that his words will outlast the stone walls around him. While the scribes were writing history, the doctors were trying to keep people alive long enough to make it. Ancient Egyptian medicine was a strange mix of magic and genuine science, but when they got it right, they were centuries ahead of their time. The most famous medical text is the Edwin Smith Papyrus. Unlike other texts that suggest using spells to cure snake bites, this one is practical. It contains the very first written mention of the word brain in human history. It describes the brain as having a corrugated surface, like slag on molten copper. The doctors knew that head injuries could affect other parts of the body. They observed that if you smashed the left side of a man's skull, he might lose the ability to move his right leg. They understood the connection between the brain and the nervous system, even if they didn't have a word for nerves. They also set broken bones using splints made of reeds and linen stiffened with plaster, basically the same concept as a modern cast. If you had an open wound, the doctor might do something that sounds disgusting. He would slap a piece of moldy bread on it. This wasn't just a random guess. The mold on the bread was likely penicillium, the fungus that produces penicillin. They were using antibiotics thousands of years before Alexander Fleming discovered them in a lab. They also used honey on burns and cuts. Honey is a natural antiseptic. It draws moisture out of bacteria, killing them. A wound dressed with honey stays clean and heals faster. Despite these advances, dentistry was a nightmare. We already talked about the sand in the bread, but it gets worse. They didn't have fillings or root canals. If a tooth got infected, it usually just stayed infected until it killed the nerve or killed you. They believed that tooth decay was caused by toothworms that bored into the tooth. To cure this, they would apply henbane, which is a mild narcotic, to numb the pain, but they couldn't stop the rot. There is almost no evidence of Egyptians pulling teeth. They seem to prefer letting them fall out on their own. However, they were pioneers in prosthetics. We have found a mummy of a woman with a wooden big toe. This wasn't just for looks in the coffin. The toe was articulated with leather straps and showed signs of wear on the bottom. Tests done by modern researchers show that it actually helped her walk. It is the oldest functional prosthetic device ever found, dating back nearly 3,000 years. Their science wasn't limited to the human body. It extended to the stars. The Egyptians invented the 365-day calendar. They noticed that the Nile flood always arrived right after the star Sirius, which they called Sothis, rose in the sky just before sunrise. They divided the year into 12 months of 30 days each, which equals 360 days. To make the math work, they added 5 epagomenal days at the end of the year, days of feasting to celebrate the birthdays of the gods Osiris, Isis, Set, Nephthys, and Horus. They considered these 5 days to be dangerous and unlucky for work, so they just partied instead. They also gave us the 24-hour day. They divided the daylight into 12 hours and the night into 12 hours. However, these weren't fixed hours like ours. In the summer, when the days were long, a daytime hour was longer than a nighttime hour. They used shadow clocks, sundials, to measure the day, and water clocks, clepsydras, to measure the night. A water clock is just a stone bowl with a small hole in the bottom. As the water drips out, the level drops past markings on the inside that tell the time. All those pyramids required heavy-duty math. They used a decimal system, just like us, but they didn't have a zero. They had separate symbols for 1, 10, 100, 1000, and so on. To write the number 235, they would draw 2 coils of rope, hundreds, 3 hobbles, tens, and 5 strokes, ones. It was cumbersome, but it worked. They understood geometry deeply. They knew how to calculate the volume of a pyramid and a cylinder. They even had a specific value for pi, which they calculated as roughly 3.16. Not perfect, but close enough to build the Great Pyramid. They were also chemists. The word chemistry actually comes from the word Kemet, Egypt. It originally meant the Egyptian art. They were masters of making glass and faience, a blue-green ceramic material that looks like turquoise but is much cheaper. They created pigments that are still bright today. Egyptian blue is the world's first synthetic pigment. It's a complex mixture of silica, lime, copper, and alkali that they heated to over 800 degrees Celsius. We still use the same chemical formula today in some specialized applications. But for all their knowledge, they had limits. They believed the heart was the center of thinking, and the brain was just there to produce mucus for the nose. They thought arteries carried air, not just blood. When their science failed, they turned back to magic. The Ebers Papyrus, another huge medical scroll, lists hundreds of practical cures, but it also includes spells to drive out demons that cause disease. To them, there was no line between a doctor and a priest. They were often the same person, the soi. Fascinating stuff, right? And hey, subscribe if you want to. More boring facts are here whenever you need them. You'll always know where to find Keeper of Sleep when you can't sleep. Now, speaking of boundaries, they didn't just map the body, they mapped the sky. They identified 5 planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. They called Mars the Red Horus. They used a tool called a Merket, which was basically a stick with a plumb line, to track the movement of stars so they could align their temples perfectly. This alignment wasn't just obsessive, it was practical. It helped them tell time at night for the temple rituals. Their engineering didn't stop at stone. They were masters of hydraulics. We mentioned the Shaduf, but they also built massive canals to divert the Nile. The Fayum Oasis was created by a series of canals that flooded a natural depression in the desert, turning it into a lush garden that produced food for the entire country. It was one of the first large-scale terraforming projects in history. And let's not forget cosmetics, which were actually a form of medical technology. The heavy black coal eyeliner they wore wasn't just for fashion. It was made of galena, lead sulfide. This sounds toxic, but the lead killed bacteria in the eye, preventing infections like conjunctivitis. which was common in the dusty, fly-filled environment. It also reduced the glare of the sun, like football players putting black grease under their eyes. It was beauty, yes, but it was also survival. As the doctor finished his rounds, he might check his water clock. The night was passing. He had set a bone, dispensed some honey for a burn, and recited a spell for a sick child. He had done his best to hold back the chaos of disease using the tools of order, observation, measurement, and the accumulated wisdom of the House of Life, the medical library attached to the temple. He knew that eventually Anubis comes for everyone, but his job was to delay that meeting as long as possible. In the modern world, a pet is a companion. In ancient Egypt, a pet was often a god sleeping at the foot of your bed. The most famous of these is, of course, the cat. The first cat in history to have a recorded name lived during the reign of Thutmose III. His name was Nejem, which literally translates to sweetie. It's comforting to know that 3,500 years ago, people were already naming their apex predators sweetie. But cats weren't just cute. They were legally protected. Killing a cat, even by accident, was a capital offense punishable by death. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus recorded a story where a Roman soldier accidentally killed a cat. Despite the pharaoh's desperate attempts to calm the situation to avoid a war with Rome, an angry mob of Egyptians lynched the soldier. To them, he hadn't just killed an animal. He had murdered a daughter of the goddess Bastet. The Egyptians domesticated the African wild cat because it was the perfect solution to their biggest problem: rats eating the grain in the silos. But their love for animals went far beyond utility. In the temple of Memphis, they worshipped a living bull called the Apis bull. This wasn't just any bull. It had to have very specific markings: a black body, a white triangle on his forehead, and a spot resembling an eagle on his back. This bull lived in a palace, slept on soft rugs, and was fed a diet of cakes and honey. When it died, the entire nation went into mourning, and it was mummified with the same pomp as a pharaoh, buried in a massive stone sarcophagus in the Serapeum. At the temple of Kom-Ombo, the priest kept a living crocodile to represent the god Sobek. This crocodile was draped in jewelry, with gold rings on its claws and earrings in its ears. It lived in a sacred pool and was hand-fed meat and honey cakes by terrified priests. When it died, it was mummified and replaced by a new one. Today, you can still see a museum full of these mummified crocodiles at the site. But not all interactions with animals were worshipful. Hippopotamus hunting was a sport for the brave and the foolish. We've mentioned how dangerous hippos are. A male hippo can bite a crocodile in half. The pharaohs would hunt them with harpoons from small skiffs. It was a display of dominance over chaos. King Tutankhamun was buried with a golden statue of himself, standing on a papyrus boat, poised to throw a harpoon at an invisible hippo. Some historians even theorize that Tutankhamun's death might have been caused by a hippo hunt gone wrong, given the crushing damage found on his chest wall. The police force, known as the Medjay, didn't just use dogs. They also used trained baboons. These monkeys were used to catch thieves in the marketplace. A baboon is faster than a human, can climb walls, and has terrifying teeth. There are tomb paintings showing a policeman releasing a baboon on a leash to tackle a criminal. It brings a whole new meaning to the term monkey business. The wealthy loved to show off their status with exotic pets. If you were really rich, you didn't just have a dog. You had a cheetah imported from the south. These cheetahs were kept on leashes and used for hunting gazelles. We also have records of pharaohs keeping giraffes, bears, and even elephants in their private zoos. Queen Hatshepsut organized an expedition to the land of Punt, modern-day Somalia, and brought back live monkeys, panthers, and giraffes to live in her temple gardens. But the most common interaction with animals in the religious sphere was the votive offering. Millions, literally millions of animals were bred, killed, and mummified to be sold to pilgrims. If you wanted to ask Thoth for wisdom, you bought a mummified ibis. If you wanted to ask Bastet for fertility, you bought a mummified cat. The industry was massive. Modern scans of these mummies reveal a bit of a scam. Many of them contain only a few bones, or just a bundle of feathers and mud. It seems the priests were running a mystery box business, and the gods apparently didn't mind the lack of quality control. Even the humblest insects were noticed. We talked about the scarab, but they also respected bees. Honey was the only sweetener they had, and it was also used for medicine and embalming. The bee was the symbol of Lower Egypt. The pharaoh's title was often he of the sedge and the bee, representing his rule over the south, the sedge plant, and the north, the bee. Scorpions were a daily threat. They were so common that there was a goddess specifically for them, Serket. She is depicted with a scorpion on her head. Her priests were essentially the paramedics of ancient Egypt, specializing in treating scorpion stings and snake bites. The sheer number of spells against snakes in the pyramid texts shows just how much the Egyptians feared the creatures slithering in the sand. Fascinating stuff, right? And hey, subscribe if you want to. More boring facts are here whenever you need them. You'll always know where to find Keeper of Sleep when you can't sleep. Now, speaking of things that slither, the cobra was the symbol of royalty, but it was also a very real danger. The Egyptian cobra can grow up to 8 feet long and possesses a neurotoxic venom that can kill a human in 30 minutes. The uraeus on the king's crown wasn't just a symbol, it was a threat. It said, "I am as deadly as the snake." The love for pets extended to the afterlife. We have found tombs where people were buried with their dogs, complete with their own tiny coffins. One famous mummy of a gazelle was found prepared with the same care as a royal child, wrapped in fine linen and placed in a custom-made wooden box. It seems the Egyptians couldn't bear the thought of spending eternity without their furry friends. As the sun sets over the desert, the sounds of the human world fade and the animal world takes over. The howl of the jackal, the voice of Anubis, drifts across the dunes. The bats fly out from the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings. The crocodiles slide silently into the dark water of the Nile. For the ancient Egyptians, this wasn't just nature. It was a divine drama playing out every night, a reminder that the gods were everywhere, wearing fur, scales, and feathers. We often think of the ancient world as a place where women had no power, but Egypt was a striking exception. In the land of the Nile, women were legally equal to men. This wasn't just a polite fiction, it was the law. A woman could own her own house, buy her own land, and run her own business. If someone owed her money, she could sue them in court, and she didn't need a man to speak for her. She stood before the judge on her own 2 feet, a right that women in some modern countries didn't get until the 20th century. Marriage in Egypt wasn't a religious ceremony, it was a contract. And like any good contract, it had an exit clause. Women had the right to initiate a divorce. They didn't need to prove abuse or adultery. They just had to say they wanted out. The marriage contracts were very specific about what happened next. If a man divorced his wife, he had to pay her a fine, often amounting to a significant portion of his wealth. He also had to return her dowry. This system acted as a powerful deterrent against men dumping their wives for younger women. It was effectively the invention of alimony. The title Mistress of the House, Nebet Per, was one of dignity. It didn't mean she was just a housewife. It meant she was the CEO of the estate. While the husband was out in the fields or at the office, she controlled the keys to the storehouses, managed the servants, and balanced the household budget. In a society without banks, the person who controlled the grain silos controlled the family's survival. However, biology was still a dangerous reality. Childbirth was the leading cause of death for women. To protect them, they turned to a god who looked nothing like the tall, handsome pharaohs. His name was Bes. He was a dwarf god with a lion's mane, sticking his tongue out. He was ugly on purpose, to scare away evil spirits. Women would keep statues of Bes in their birthing rooms and wear amulets of his face. He was the divine bouncer, keeping death away from the cradle. They also had a surprisingly scientific way to test for pregnancy. A woman would urinate on 2 bags of seeds, one of barley and one of wheat. If the seed sprouted, she was pregnant. Modern scientists have actually tested this, and it works about 70% of the time. The hormones in a pregnant woman's urine really do stimulate plant growth. The Egyptians took it a step further, claiming that if the barley sprouted, it was a boy, and if the wheat sprouted, it was a girl. That part, unfortunately, was just a guess. Block 12. The end of eternity. For thousands of years, Egypt was protected by its deserts. It was an island of peace in a violent world. But eventually, the world came knocking. The first major shock came from the Hyksos, invaders from the Middle East, who introduced a terrifying new weapon, the chariot. Before this, Egyptians fought on foot with simple bows and axes. The chariot was the tank of the Bronze Age. It allowed archers to move at high speeds, raining death on infantry who couldn't catch them. The Egyptians, being pragmatic, didn't just complain. They copied it. They built their own chariots, lighter and faster than the Hyksos version, and used them to drive the invaders out. They also adopted a new sword, the Khopesh. It looked like a sickle or a question mark made of bronze. It wasn't just for hacking. The hook on the end could be used to snag an enemy's shield and pull it down, exposing them to a fatal strike. With these weapons, pharaohs like Ramses II marched out to build an empire. Ramses II is famous for fighting the Hittites, but his greatest achievement was actually peace. After the Battle of Kadesh, which ended in a stalemate, he signed the world's first known peace treaty. We have copies of it today. It included a non-aggression pact and even an extradition clause. If a criminal fled from Egypt to Hittite land, the Hittites had to send him back. A copy of this treaty is displayed at the United Nations headquarters in New York today as a symbol of diplomacy. But the Bronze Age ended in catastrophe. A mysterious group called the Sea Peoples swept across the Mediterranean, destroying civilizations. They crushed the Hittites and burned cities to the ground. When they reached Egypt, Ramses III barely managed to fight them off in a massive naval battle in the Nile Delta. Egypt survived, but it was exhausted. The treasury was empty, and the central government began to crack. Centuries of slow decline followed. The Persians invaded, then the Greeks, led by Alexander the Great. When Alexander died, his general Ptolemy took over, starting a Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt for 300 years. The most famous of these rulers was Cleopatra VII. Unlike her ancestors, she actually bothered to learn the Egyptian language. She was a brilliant politician who tried to save her country by allying with the most powerful men in Rome, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. It didn't work. After her defeat and suicide, Egypt became just another province of the Roman Empire. The Emperor Augustus treated Egypt like his personal piggy bank, using its massive grain harvest to feed the mobs of Rome. The pharaohs were gone. The temples were slowly abandoned. The hieroglyphs were forgotten. Yet, in a way, Egypt never really fell. We still use their 365-day calendar. We still use their 24-hour day. We still use paper, which they invented. Their medical knowledge passed into Greece and then to us. The end of eternity was just a transformation. The sand has covered their cities, but the foundation they laid is what the modern world is built on. The Nile still flows, the sun still rises, and thanks to the scribes who wrote it all down, the names of their kings are still spoken, keeping them alive in the only way that truly matters. And hey, subscribe if you want to. More boring facts are here whenever you need them. You'll always know where to find Keeper of Sleep when you can't sleep. Good night.